There are certain phrases that don't get you fired on the spot, they just get repeated, quietly, in rooms you are never invited to. Most people think this is a tone problem. It is not. It is a memory problem. Managers do not write essays about you. They write short lines, and short lines stick. I've sat in meetings where those exact lines get read back months later, completely out of context, long after you forgot you said them. Today, I am walking you through 7 phrases that do this quietly, and the very different reason each one backfires. I'm Dre. I've sat close enough to manager conversations, calibration talks, and performance write-ups to know that what you say in a one-on-one and what ends up in a note about you are 2 different documents. I can't speak for every manager or every company, but the patterns repeat enough that they're worth knowing. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Here's what I want you to walk away with. It's not that you were wrong. Most of the time, you were right. The problem is what the phrase signals, separate from whether it was true. Trust, ownership, flight risk. Managers aren't grading your honesty. They're scanning for risk, usually without even realizing that's what they're doing. And some completely reasonable things you say get filed under risk without you ever knowing it happened, without anyone ever sitting you down to explain it. So let's start with the pattern you'll hear me repeat the whole way through this. Yes, this phrase really can hurt you, but not for the reason you'd assume. First one, that's not my job. You think you're protecting your time. You think you're drawing a boundary. Functionally, inside a calibration conversation, it often gets logged as something else entirely, an ownership flag, not a boundaries problem, a flexibility problem. Here's the part people don't realize. When a manager is building the case for who gets stretched into more responsibility, they're mentally sorting people into 2 piles, whether they'd admit that out loud or not. People who expand, people who defend their lane. Let's say a manager is fielding a promotion conversation 6 months later, and someone in the room asks, has she shown she can take on more? That one line, said once, in a moment that felt completely justified, is sometimes the exact thing that gets quoted back, word for word. You meant, I'm focused. They heard, I won't stretch. And that's the tame one. The next phrase is worse because it sounds like loyalty to the truth. I already told you that. Or the sharper cousin, I told you so. Being right should be safe. It rarely is. In systems I've worked with, this phrase gets read less as accuracy and more as a trust signal. Specifically, how much friction comes with giving this person feedback in the future. Managers start quietly bracing before disagreements with you, and they don't always know they're doing it. That's not written down as difficult. It's written down as communication style, which, guess what, is often code for exactly this. I've personally seen versions of this play out where one sharp I told you so in a group setting, just one, becomes the anecdote a manager reaches for later to explain hesitation about escalating someone into a bigger role. Being correct got recorded as being combative. Now here's one that feels like the opposite of that, total agreement, and it can do just as much damage. Whatever you think is best. Said once, it's nothing. Said as a default, repeatedly, it starts reading as an absence of judgment. This is where people misunderstand it the most. Trying to be easy to manage and trying to be trusted with more are not the same skill, and managers know the difference even when they can't articulate it out loud. Let's say 2 people are being considered for a lead role. One has a documented pattern of deferring in meetings. One has a pattern of proposing, even when the proposal gets shot down half the time. The deferring one usually loses by default, not by decision, and nobody ever tells them that's what happened. It just quietly stops counting in your favor. The next one isn't about agreement or disagreement at all. It's a phrase that sounds honest and reads as a threat. I'm just being honest. Here's where the conspiracy version falls apart, and the boring version becomes the scarier one. This phrase almost never causes the problem by itself. It's usually the sentence right before something blunt or personal lands. So managers start pattern matching the phrase itself to incoming friction, almost like an early warning system. Internal feedback rarely says, too honest. It says, communication style, or deliver. And in systems I've worked with, that language is frequently standing in for exactly this pattern. The content was right. The framing became the entire story anyway. I know that's not fair. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying that's how it gets read on the other side of the table. This next one is quiet. It barely sounds like anything, and it might be the most damaging phrase on this list. That's above my pay grade. It sounds humble. It sounds like appropriate awareness of your scope. Repeat it, it becomes shorthand in succession planning conversations for capped ambition. Here's the uncomfortable part. Nobody confronts you about it. Ever. A manager filling a lead role simply skips past someone who said a version of this more than once without ever raising it directly, without ever giving you the chance to correct the impression. A phrase built to sound modest quietly writes you out of rooms you didn't even know you were being considered for. The next two aren't about tone at all. They're about paperwork. And they're the ones people reach for when they think they're protecting themselves. I need that in writing. Reasonable in context. Use reflexively. Before there's even a real conflict, it can register as adversarial before anything has actually gone wrong. And here's the twist people don't expect. The tool built to create trust is sometimes the exact thing that starts eroding it. I've seen versions where a manager begins quietly pre-filtering what they say to someone in meetings, not because that person did anything wrong, just out of caution, because the relationship started to feel like it needed documentation before it needed conversation. That shift is subtle, and it almost never gets discussed directly. It just changes how much a manager volunteers to you going forward. Last one. This is the phrase that sounds the most reasonable out of all 7, and it does the most long-term damage. This is how we've always done it. It feels like context, institutional memory, helpful history. In change-heavy environments, especially during a reorg, this becomes shorthand in someone's notes for resistance to new direction. Nobody has to write resistant to change for that impression to form. They just have to remember this line being said more than once, at the wrong moments, usually right when leadership is trying to build momentum for something new. Let's say a reorg happens, and leadership is deciding who stays close to the new initiatives and who doesn't. That phrase, remembered or documented, quietly becomes one factor in that decision, even if it's never the stated reason. Familiarity with the old system gets mistaken for resistance to the new one. None of these 7 phrases get you fired. That's exactly what makes them dangerous. They just quietly write the story that gets told about you when you're not in the room. Now, I want to slow down here, because I don't want you leaving this video thinking one bad meeting ends your career. It doesn't. Saying one of these phrases once, in a reasonable context, under reasonable pressure, is not a career-ending event. What actually matters is the difference between a single moment and a repeated pattern, and the difference between a repeated pattern and a pattern that gets tied to an actual decision, a passed-over promotion, a performance conversation, a reorg, a restructuring. Most of what happens in a normal working relationship is just noise. It doesn't get filed anywhere. It doesn't follow you into the next review cycle. I also want to be fair here, because managers misread tone constantly, and they carry their own bad days into these judgments too. This isn't me telling you that employees are secretly bad and managers are secretly right. It's short language creating long impressions in both directions, filtered through people who are just as inconsistent as anyone else. That's the mechanism. It's not a morality play, and it's definitely not a conspiracy. Here's how you actually notice if something like this might be happening to you. And I want to be careful with this part because you can't see internal notes, and neither can I for you. This doesn't prove anything, but it may be a signal. Feedback that keeps circling back to communication style or team player without ever giving you a specific example. Getting passed over for stretch projects even when your actual output is solid. A manager who used to loop you in early on decisions who quietly stops doing that without explanation, without any conversation about why. One instance of any of this means basically nothing. A repeated pattern, especially one that shows up across multiple reviews or multiple managers, is what actually matters. And the good news, genuinely, is that most of this is preventable because you're not being asked to stop telling the truth. You're being asked to say the same true thing in a way that doesn't get filed as a red flag. So here's what that actually looks like in practice. Instead of, "That's not my job," try naming what you can take on instead of what you can't. Ownership over deflection. Instead of, "I told you so," ask what changed. Curiosity over correction. Instead of defaulting to, "Whatever you think is best," propose something, even a small idea, even one you expect to get overridden. Because managers remember who offers direction, not just who accepts it without pushback. Instead of leading with, "I'm just being honest," lead with the point itself and let the honesty speak for itself instead of announcing it first, which almost always puts people on guard. Instead of reflexively asking for things in writing, give context first and reserve documentation for when there's an actual reason, not as a default posture toward everyone. And instead of, "This is how we've always done it," reframe it as information the new plan might actually need, not resistance to it. Because the same knowledge, framed as input instead of objection, reads completely differently. I want to be honest with you about something else too. You may not be able to undo an impression that's already been building for months or longer. If a pattern has already formed, one good conversation won't erase it. And I'd be lying if I told you it could. What you can control going forward is consistency. And consistency is the thing that actually rewrites an impression over time, not one dramatic correction, not one perfectly worded meeting. So here's the full circle. These 7 phrases don't get you fired on the spot. That part was true from the beginning. What actually happens is quieter than that, and honestly, more unsettling. Because it's not a single decision. It's a slow accumulation of short lines that get repeated in rooms you're never in, by people who mostly aren't trying to hurt you. It's not a blacklist. Nobody's plotting against you. It's just memory, pattern, and framing, doing what memory, pattern, and framing always do inside any workplace. The goal isn't to filter yourself into silence. You're allowed to say the true thing. The goal is making sure what you say gets remembered the way you actually meant it, instead of the way it happened to land in a room you weren't standing in.